Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 4th of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio is Mike Robinson, of course.
And we should say Happy New Year.
And we're going to say Happy New Year, and also apologies for yesterday. I'm afraid that some technical issues got the better of us and we weren't able to broadcast, but we're back online today and pretty powerful news. Mike.
Well, we're starting off with Theresa May. Here she is on screen in her other form. I was going to put some heavy beads around the neck of this little dragon here, but unfortunately I didn't quite have time. But it doesn't matter. I'm quite certain that whatever this is will be made into a pair of Theresa May shoes at some later date. But as we can see, what we're talking about here is unlocking £330 million. This is £330 million which is being stolen from dormant bank accounts by the UK government. This follows the 2008 Dormant Bank and Building Society Accounts Act. And after that, they set up the Reclaim Fund Limited, which was established by the Cooperative Banking Group Limited, to administer the process of the dormant account scheme. Now, of course, this is about money which is in accounts which are unclaimed. They're supposedly dormant. Well, the government says that, of course, if somebody notices that money has gone missing out of a dormant account at some later date, that they can reclaim the money, apparently, but I'm not certain that anybody has done that. Nonetheless, there's money sitting in accounts, which is not the government's, and they've decided they can take it. £280 million is going to be allocated across England. It's all for really good causes, Brian. They say that they're going to help disadvantaged young people into work. They say they're going to help provide housing for families and vulnerable people. They say that they're going to tackle problem debt, that they're going to tackle homelessness. This is what they're going to do. But they've already identified £1 billion of dormant account money, and £360 million has so far already been directed towards good causes. And I haven't noticed too much difference in terms of getting disadvantaged young people into work, helping homeless people, or providing housing for families and vulnerable people. Have you?
None at all. In fact, all the evidence we're seeing is that it's getting worse for people at the people who are short of money, people who are out of work. So where's the money going?
Well, it's going to be allocated through, for example, the Big Society Capital.
Oh, right.
Which, of course, is not really very much to do with actually getting money to the coalface directly. It's about supporting NGOs that are fulfilling the government's desire to build the big society.
Yeah, a lot of people have forgotten about big society. They think that David Cameron's big society was an idea which then disappeared. Of course, this is absolutely untrue. Big society is very much alive and well in the background. The recruiting and training of hundreds of thousands of young teenage activists, that's all happening. So is the use of the non-government organisations that Mike's just mentioned, all for political purposes. And of course, all this requires funding, and that's being done through the channel of the Big Society Capital route. So if you don't know anything about this, get onto the UK Column website and just do a search for Big Society, and you will find some of our analysis over the last couple of years.
Now, this was in yesterday's Daily Express front page, health tourism scandal. And really, I wanted to sort of flag this up for two reasons. First of all, because I think we can say, Brian, that the National Health Service is going to be one of our key topics for this year. This is the 70th anniversary of the NHS.
Yes.
And clearly the privatisation scandal continues to roll on. Deaths in hospitals continues to roll on.
And attacks on the staff. What I mean by that is propaganda attacks on the staff. The staff are at fault. They're not doing their job properly. NHS is losing the money. In fact, it's the fault of the patients.
Yes.
You're too old. You shouldn't be in the NHS.
Absolutely. Now, the headline says health tourism scandal, foreign mums in £16 million NHS rip-off. And really, I just thought to myself, well, £16 million in the greater scheme of things with regard to the level of wastage within the NHS, but through common purpose courses, dodgy management and all this kind of stuff. The fact that money is not being allocated at the coalface to the doctors and the nurses that actually need it. This is not about the NHS at all. This is about something else. I think. £16 million. Let's bring a Mail Online headline from last year. I think this was from the middle of last year. How the NHS wastes a staggering £7.6 billion a year on overpriced loo rolls, lost crutches and wheelchairs, and management consultants. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So £16 million isn't really that big a scandal if you put it in that context. I don't like the Mail's headline here either, but the issues with the NHS are bigger than a few people coming over allegedly to give birth over here because it's free.
Yeah, and if we look back to the woes of the NHS, it's never been perfect, but of course the problem started when that route to privatisation started and the management consultants were brought in, when Common Purpose was brought in, pushing, quote, 1 million change agents, their words, not mine. So this is part of the story which UK Column will be telling this year, is what is really happening to the NHS. Perhaps we should just give Alex, we've got Alex Thomson with us today. Alex, what's your thoughts on what's taking place with the NHS at the moment?
Well, I can best compare it, Brian, with what's happening here in the Netherlands, because by looking at a similar but not identical system, you can work out what the distinctives are of a particular system. And without getting ideological about healthcare systems, I see that Dutch hospitals and a number of other countries which have a non-state system, these hospitals are cleaner. There is much less toleration of outsourcing or of sloppy standards by the junior staff or overworking of senior staff. They're much better at putting their foot down about that, both the staff and the patients. I do see that costs are spiralling out of hand. A big thing in Dutch politics at the moment is the number of pharmaceutical people who've got themselves seats in Parliament by joining the mainstream party cabal. And this is something which the minor parties are beginning to carp at with good reason. And in Britain, of course, we don't go for that MP model. We send the pharmaceutical people to the lobby or into the third sector. But again, by mirroring what's happening in Britain with the continent, particularly the more Britain-like countries like the Netherlands, you can see what the common themes are despite the differences in system. And the continuity, or the main aspect, seems to be pharmaceutical companies getting a really big foothold in the NHS. And yes, absolutely, we do want to make it a theme for 2018, helping patients, users and staff in the NHS work out what is going on. And we're not just saying big pharma as a kind of bandying around phrase here. There is really something to do with a cabal of people going on that's gutting the NHS. And it began within the establishment. Think of Oliver Letwin's paper to the Cabinet in 1981, which has only recently been disclassified, which was about easing people into the idea that healthcare is really too dear to pay for, on the state. You should go private.
Yep. Okay, Alex, thank you very much for that. Well, the BBC is certainly not helping to support the NHS. Couldn't help but pick up on the front page. This is from yesterday, actually. What caught my eye was this, the red button. It was obviously there to catch your eye. And I just found this astonishing. Trump to Kim, my button's bigger than yours. So this is the BBC simply sniggering and making fun at the possibility of war. Alongside the button, of course, we had Iran. So these are the two hot topics. But childish, immature humour from the BBC, as it itself helps to ramp up violence and trouble overseas. And we're going to have a look at this. But what has Boris Johnson been saying, Mike?
Well, Boris made a statement about the ongoing protests in Iran yesterday. He said the UK is watching events in Iran closely. We believe that there should be meaningful debate about the legitimate and important issues the protesters are raising, and we look to the Iranian authorities to permit this. We also believe that, particularly as we enter the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, people should be able to have the freedom of expression to demonstrate peacefully within the law. We regret the loss of life that has occurred in the protests in Iran and call on all concerned to refrain from the violence and for international obligations on human rights to be observed. Now, I have to say, you could, it is clear that the players in this are different to Syria in 2011. Saudi Arabia is involved and so on in helping foment this unrest in Iran. But Alex, it looks to me like a very similar situation to Syria in 2011. We've got a colour revolution style thing being attempted here, where we get people grabbing on to legitimate concerns that individuals have within a country and then they use that as a mechanism for bringing people out onto the streets and building this up into something which it might otherwise not have been.
That's a fair assessment, Mike. And I think the first thing that people have to establish about this Iranian situation is that there are few parallels between Iran and the other countries which have been color revolutioned. Undoubtedly, a color revolution is being planned, but it will be of a different kind than Syria. You're quite right to say that the disgruntlement is the same. But Iran really is better compared with Ukraine and Egypt rather than the Arab bunch of countries and the former Soviet republics, because in the cases of the Arab countries, or the Sunni Arab Muslim countries, in Syria's case, many religious minorities besides, and in the case of the Soviets, former Soviet states that had color revolutions, there you had a fairly simple situation by comparison, or Georgia and Lebanon are very complex countries, but the idea there was you just find disgruntled actors and form an alternative government and people won't notice you slipping things in. You can't do that with Iran or with Ukraine or Egypt. These are massive countries which since antiquity have been recognized for the potential of the population and the land that they sit on, and they need special treatment by any global revolutionary ideology. The treatment that is chosen is really setting the urban irreligious people against the rural religious people. We've seen that with the My Stealthy Freedom campaign and the BBC getting in. I'm sure Brian will be talking about things like that later. In essence, there are very legitimate grievances in Iran, but people are hyper intelligent and historically aware in Iran, and they're well aware that any movement which is tarred with the brush of Israel or the West will lose legitimacy immediately. So it's almost the kiss of death, really. If you see a genuine movement getting steam among the urban youth, for example, North Tehran, where most people don't even believe Islam anymore. It's just it's a bubble of the West in the Near East. If you can latch onto that and suggest, even if it's not true, that the groups in question have got Western backers, that in itself is a clever way of giving such a movement the kiss of death. Now, we could go a bit further and talk about the fact that the British and Americans have now admitted that they unseated Mossadegh in 1953. Of course, Iran was making major moves towards being a constitutional country and using its energy for the benefit of its population. And of course, the same applies with the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic regime in 1979. There's a huge complex of history which we can't get into. Iran has distinctives that people are fed up, but they're very wary of a repeat of Ukraine and Egypt, because they're well aware that in the case of a powerful, promising country like Iran, Ukraine, Egypt, so much is at stake that there's going to be many layers of disinformation playing.
Alex, thank you for that. Let's just take a couple of minutes to have a look through how the BBC is approaching Iran at the moment, and we've got to come straight in with BBC Persian. This is the BBC's Persian service. And Rana Rahimpour is the key lady. She features in a video on the BBC website. And this is pretty black and white, to me, propaganda. I've just taken this particular slide. Back in 2009, protests were mainly based in the capital, Tehran. But she goes on very proud to say that those protests are now spreading throughout Iran. So this is not about quietly analysing the situation and attempting to help calm things down. No, this is encouraging people inside Iran to think that this protest movement is extremely widespread across the whole of Iran. And of course, we have to say from Syria to Iran, because UK column warned about the activities with the BBC's own media action in stirring up unrest in Syria. What's the BBC heading for here? Well, we've got to say that it's regime change, because in the video, of course, it's not just about protests. Here we've got the BBC pushing the angle, and protesters started calling for the downfall of Iran's most powerful man, Ali Khamenei. So this is very clear-cut stuff. And if we look at the lady herself, always good to go to their individual Twitter page. They've now gone on to the other foot here, because she's desperately unhappy that Iran has now been taking measures against BBC Persian journalists. And here's one of the articles that appeared. I think this is from the Telegraph. Iran tries to silence BBC Persian by harassing journalists' families. So it's those nasty Iranians attacking the BBC, but of course it's the BBC putting the propaganda into Iran. Here we've got her latching on to Zaghari Radcliffe, the lady who's in prison at the moment. And of course, she is totally innocent of any attempt to manipulate politics inside Iran. This lady has simply been grabbed by those nasty Iranians and locked up in prison. More tweets circulated here from Rashimpur. So she's very big in what's going on, urging the Foreign Secretary to raise the plight of at BBC Persian staff and families. So we're using the BBC to fight a campaign for the BBC's own journalists, even though we can question what those journalists are doing. And if you haven't ever visited the BBC Persian website, encourage you to do it. I couldn't find easily how you translated the page, so at the moment this is not readable to me, but I'd be grateful for some advice. And if we have a look in the wider internet, we can see, of course, that we've got the BBC and other mainstream papers saying how nasty those Iranians have been to have this lady locked up at the moment. This is the main article I just showed you, so if you freeze the page, you can have a look at this. But where is all this organisation coming from? Well, we have to come back to UK column analysis of what the BBC really is. It is not just one organisation. It's many organisations hidden behind walls and smoke screens and firewalls. But this is part of the key area, the BBC monitoring and BBC Media Action, the charity, because these are the areas that have been working to pick up what's happening in other countries and influence the politics. So there's BBC Persian, a sort of overview of it, started in 2008. There's some detail on it here because it starts to inform us that, well, this isn't just the BBC, this is actually financed by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And I think you've got a few comments on that a little bit later, Mike. But this is not the BBC, this is the British government acting through the BBC and funding it. So we remind ourselves, Julia Harkin, former member of BBC Media Action, boasting of the work that they were doing inside Syria to help destabilise Assad. And with that in mind, let's have a look at how these pieces come together. And we need to remember this man, John Tusa, former general manager of BBC. He was speaking in 1991, and he was actually saying that basically the BBC was using its Marshall Plan of the mind, which would use radio to bring instructional broadcasts in history, banking, accounting, and communication to the emerging democracies of Europe. How interesting, the BBC thought people needed to be talking about banking. We then see that the Marshall Plan of the Mind Inform was a company controlled by BBC Media Action, supposedly a charity. Here's Julia again. And now we can bring in what's happening to attack Iran. So if we sum this up, wherever the BBC puts these in-country programs, we see them starting to attack the democratic, or the the in-house government. If the BBC doesn't consider them democratic, they can attack. And I was fascinated to see this report from Hansard in 1994, May 1994, where Mr. Barnes said this: why is this crude capitalist propaganda being pushed out in the Russian media with the help of the government know-how funds? And why does it have charitable status? Why does not the programme show what life is really like in free market Britain, with 5 million unemployed, a third of our children living in poverty, 500,000 people on housing lists, and 500,000 building workers out of work? Look at the response here from Mr. Brooke. The honourable gentleman misses the point of the programme. The purpose of the Marshall Plan of the Mind is to assist the people of Russia to make progress economically over a wide front and in a number of imaginative ways. The BBC has received extremely enthusiastic responses from the Russian audiences that have seen it, and frankly, the honourable gentleman's question is a disgrace. Well, on the contrary, Mike, I think that Mr. Barnes was spot on. He's identified a propaganda machine.
Well, some of the other stuff that's going on in Iran at the moment, if we have a look at this. Now, this is a video clip that was on Iranian media. It was pushed out by somebody on Twitter saying an Iranian shot by a non-native. He was told to say that the police had shot him. This reminds me very much of what was going on in Syria in 2011. I wanted to get money from an ATM. Protesters shot me with a gun, at me with a gun. They asked me to say that the police shot me. They were non-native. So we already appear to have suggestions that foreigners are in Iran agitating. Absolutely.
And similar to snipers in Eastern Europe,
right,
at the start of the Troubles.
Well, we had this yesterday in RT, which is Mr. McFaul, the former US ambassador to Russia, who was pumping out some video of the Iranian protests on Twitter and had to apologize following that because, well, oh dear, it appeared to be fake video. Here is the video, which somebody else was pushing out as well. This is being pushed out by Ali Al-Ahmed, who belongs to the Institute for Gulf Affairs, one of the big think tanks. But unfortunately, this wasn't a protest in Iran. This was a protest in Bahrain from some time ago. But this was being pushed out all through the sort of mainstream, typical mainstream commentators. Quite a number of them were pushing this out. Well, you then ask the question, who is responsible for fake news and propaganda? It's certainly not the alternative media or people searching for the truth on social media in general. Well, so there we go. Where is this going to end up, Brian?
Well, I think they want it to end up with a complete breakdown of law and order inside Iran, because in that way they can take over Iran without a military operation. So it's destroy the country from the inside. This was the policy in Iraq, it was the policy in Afghanistan, it was the policy in Libya. It's been tried in Syria, but the Russians stopped that. Now we've got the target Iran.
But Alex, apparently GCHQ has been up to some dodgy tricks as well. This is according to a hacker, now a researcher and computer science PhD at the University College in London, who was speaking to a hacking conference in Germany last week. And he is alleging that the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group has been targeting activists in Iran. And he says that the British government or the GCHQ have been using online techniques to make something happen in the real world or in the cyber world, but in the real world. He says basically a fancy name for sitting on Twitter and Facebook all day and trolling online. Is that your experience? Because we should remind ourselves that the Intercept, this was the Intercept from I think 2015, saying how their headline was "How Covert Agents Infiltrate the Internet, Manipulate, Deceive and Destroy Reputations," and also highlighting documents leaked about JTRIG. I appreciate that. I don't want to put you in a difficult position by asking you about JTRIG, but do you think this type of activity is being used to foment trouble overseas and in Iran in particular?
Yes, in a word. The Intercept has got it spot on by saying that JTRIG work is about destroying reputations. When JTRIG was being set up, the chaps I was speaking to as I popped in and out there occasionally were very interested in shaping things, making, as you say, making reputations appear or disappear overnight, making or breaking people. It's a bunch of non-traditional British spooks, mainly from GCHQ, but also from other government agencies who end up at JTRIG. I'm not disparaging them because they're quite young and keen and perhaps not much political sense of the world, very good at technology, obviously. But the one thing I would take issue with in the Persian you just quoted is that he's saying that this work basically boils down to sitting on Facebook and Twitter all day. That can't work because you need to be fluent in not just Persian in this case, but be able to type Persian in real time on a keyboard. And you need several such people, and they need to be up with geek slang as well, and be available in the time zones where the Persians are talking from California or Tehran itself. All this requires shift work and some very, very specialist and rare native speakers of Persian who've been co-opted So I don't think that there's much of that going on. It's always a pinch point getting the real-time linguists in Western intelligence services. I think it's more a case that, well, we've seen the example of a URL shortening service. These honey traps, which have been set up passively, have been put in so that you get details and people can then be approached one-to-one by human intelligence or by native Persians who've been bought into that arrangement. The real-time talking to people on Facebook and Twitter in Middle Eastern languages is a really very tall order for the intelligence services in the West. But other than that, it's an accurate picture of what's going on. It's not traditional signals intelligence. Well, it's not signals intelligence at all. It's neither fish nor fowl. It's of questionable legality and certainly lawfulness, even if the statutes have been put in place. Anyone watching perhaps from JTRIG or the rest of my old department, seek out the vanishingly few people who are still there from the baby boomer generation or just below, the old J Division hands, for example, and ask them what the department used to do and what attitudes it used to have to keeping the nation safe. You'll have to use your discretion in asking them that, but you'll be shocked by how very quickly that changed in the decade of the noughties when I was at GCHQ into something that's not lawful or anything to do with protecting the nation, really.
Alex, thank you for that. I'll just add in there, if people still don't realise about the history of the BBC and its involvement in propaganda and subversion, research is pretty easy to do, but do have a look at the organisations such as BBC Monitoring, which used to have a good role. It was listening into other countries and it was reporting accurate media. That has changed, but funded by the British government. We've now got the charity BBC Media Action, which is politically involved, and now we're taking this in-depth look at BBC Persian.
Now, you mentioned Foreign Office money going into BBC for specific purposes. Well, the Foreign Office tweeted this out yesterday, and I was just fascinated by it. The tweet says, "Explore our iconic headquarters with its virtual tour of the Foreign Office," and it links to a website. I'll show you the website in a second. But you can see the little promotional video on screen at the moment that they pushed out. Well, it was very interesting, but something just caught my eye as it was playing through, and it was this, because just for a split second, they focused on this image, I guess, from a wall, where you've got a picture of, and a lady with Japan over her head on the left, a lady with India, or a guy with India on the right, and in the center we've got Persia. And that it was Persia that was highlighted.
Is the focal point.
That was the focal point.
Yeah.
And Alex, I just thought it gave an interesting little insight into what the Foreign Office is thinking about at the moment, that they chose to focus on Persia. This is the website, the Foreign Office virtual tour. But Alex, do you agree that perhaps they've given us a clue as to what's in their minds?
Oh, yes, and bear in mind that this promotional short will have been put together by contractors, or at least some of it will be tendered out. But it's not random. I mean, that dome there is typical of any imperial building like the US State Department and Capitol, anything of that era. Nations and continents were personified as these ample-bosomed, cornucopia maidens, basically. But to focus in on Persia is very telling. That is from the old India office bit of the FCO, with its famous marble floor where you're not allowed to take red wine. It's for wowing the natives, really. But it's... even though it wasn't scripted, I don't think anyone at the Foreign Office said to the production people, you must feature Persia. I think that's not by chance. In fact, come to think of it, the FCO does have in-house production people, so they will at least have FCO badges, even if they're contractors. It's not for nothing, shall we say. Just shows how multi-level the mind game is with the Iranians. A very good recent book on Iran, or Persia, as it was for most of its history, has the title "The Empire of the Mind." And that's not chosen randomly. The Persians have just got brilliant minds. They've sat between the Roman and Chinese worlds for millennia, and they're extremely good at perception, to use a bit of David Icke terminology, perception, deception, and they can spot it when we do it at them, because they have about 3,000 years head start on us doing it at them.
Well, Brian, some more good news came out day before yesterday, and that is that the Penny Mordaunt, the new International Development Secretary, announced a new package of support for humanitarian crises that are coming in 2018. I'm not quite sure how she knows they're coming, but she does. So they're going to release a whole bunch of new aid. This is what Penny Mordaunt said. While 2017 was a year of harrowing humanitarian crises, the truth is 2018 could be even bleaker.
All right.
So
they
that's
know
good.
What's coming.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. So I've said many times, where you see UK aid money going, you see all kinds of chaos following not long behind. So looking forward to that. I'm sure the people that are receiving this aid are going to be benefiting greatly throughout the year. But let's look at what Boris said. He said that the old jam jars are being smashed. The cash will be more sensibly distributed with a view to supporting British foreign policy. So, in fact, it's not really about providing humanitarian aid to people overseas at all. It is about supporting British foreign policy and pursuing British foreign policy. And all the people, when this was announced in the mainstream press, we had people like Peter Bone MP coming out and saying, well, it's ridiculous that so much money is being spent abroad when the NHS is in such difficulties here. But of course, that argument, that entire argument is intended to enrage people and divert attention away from the fact that what we're looking at here is billions of pounds of British soft power money being used abroad. And well, Boris has had to admit it.
He's had to admit it, and let's just come back and add in the fact that we've got the British government funding the World Service. They were funding BBC monitoring, but the government's pulled out. That's now left to the British taxpayer or the licence payer of the BBC to fund that. But we've got millions of pounds into this propaganda service, which is now attacking Iran. This is an integrated plan. It's not one piece here and one piece over there. All of these pieces come together. So they're expecting conflict in Iran.
Right. Now let's move on to global Britain, because of course we're leaving the European Union, and when we do that, we've got to turn ourselves into #global Britain. And global Britain means that we're going to be trading with the world. And so Liam Fox was in China a couple of days ago. And this is his first international visit of the new year. This is good for him. He was in Beijing and in Shenzhen, and he met the Chinese Foreign Minister of Commerce. Well, this is because China is the UK's 5th largest trading partner in the world. But while he was there, it became clear that he was quite interested in Britain becoming the centre of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, the TPP, one of the 3 major global trade deals, is apparently dead because the US has resigned from it. But apparently Britain wants to step into the breach and reinvigorate it. I'm just wondering, is this Britain flogging a dead horse here? I think it probably is. But Alex, Britain really attempting to tie these trade deals together into something pretty massive. And reinvigorate the idea of the Western liberal free trade deal, which we know is an oxymoron, really.
Certainly advanced countries like the French, Germans, Dutch are prepared to do business with anyone who will keep them in their own standard of living. And so they'll invest a lot in Eurasia. They're already joined up with the Russian-Chinese infrastructure. By the way, the war for infrastructure is a very significant piece of the reason why Iran is being contended for. It's a question of whether it's the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development that gets to build the new infrastructure in Iran, Ukraine, Egypt, or whether it's the Chinese that get to do it. The Russians also have a branch line down to Bandar Abbas in Iran planned now. They announced that just before New Year. So the timing of that is not accidental either. No, it's Britain that's pushing these through its American sock puppet in many cases. The Lyndon LaRouche and others are quite right about that over the decades. And as someone in the chat room, someone very astute, Martin Edwards, who writes for the website, also has pointed out, the reason for this is that the very elite thinking in Britain and America has been, well, the French were ahead of us. They saw this in the 1960s and 70s, people like Raymond Aron and Jean Raspail, but Brits soon realized it too. The global south, the third world, was going to demand, not suggest or wish, but demand that they had the same standard of living as the global north. And since the paymasters or the money creation masters at the top of the pyramid knew they were never going to be able to do that, the plan since then has been global trade blocks with free movement of people, money and labour and capital sloshing around so that everyone is equally poor, so that there is no driver for migration anymore. So the current wave of migration is not exactly all planned. It is something that has been foreseen and that the elite wish to forestall by setting up these global blocks, all of which have Britain written all over them.
But in the meantime, Eurasia is building its infrastructure.
That's right. Thank you for showing this. This is a screenshot I took of the Russian Channel 1, the public broadcaster's depiction at the end of last year of what's going on. You can see the caption here at this point is talking about high-speed railway. Well, the interesting one is the teal-coloured or light green north-south link. You can see Helsinki at the top there and Bandar Abbas, which is the Iranian Gulf port, down at the bottom, and that goes down both sides of the Caspian Sea. So if that gets built with, as you can see on the west side, Baku in Azerbaijan, an oil-rich country there, which is at the American protectorate at the moment, and south of that is Iran. If that goes ahead, then the infrastructure is sealed. The Russians and Chinese have the ability to trade with Africa, dominate the Mediterranean, and trade right up to the English Channel, where I'm sitting here, with all the advanced countries, and exchange goods and services freely. That is what's being prevented. George Soros, for example, his own interest in one of the very few tweets he's made. He's done less than 1,000 tweets in his time. So when he does one, it's high impact. And he's often said, he's talking about Ukraine in this case, but it applies equally to his plans for Iran. He says Ukraine needs a Marshall Plan. Well, why? Because it's about the right for development, for infrastructure. If you physically control the railways and if you set the mindset of the country so that they have desires to build railways in certain directions and open certain shipping lanes, then you've got the country's economy by the short and curlies. That's really the bottom layer of what's going on with Iran at the moment.
Indeed. Now, you've just mentioned George Soros, and what have we got here on the left? A Guardian article sustaining Ukraine's breakthrough, EU expertise and markets are essential, written by George Soros. And on the right, we've got a tweet which says, he says, the new Ukraine is a rare experiment in participatory democracy. It needs more support. I presume this is all related to what's going on with Saakashvili at the moment.
It cuts in two directions, Mike. These are written in the 2014-15 timeframe by Soros. And when he thought that Ukraine, after it had been plunged into chaos by the snipers, as recently revealed, well, we knew all along, Ukraine he thought was a success story because everything was up to grabs to play for. When he wrote that Guardian piece, he started off by saying the EBRD needs to get in there, which is the elite bankers' arm's length way. It's not even EU controlled or BIS controlled. It's a sideways way of getting into the infrastructure of Greater Eurasia, basically called it Greater Europe, the periphery around Europe, down up to Iran, really, basically. The EBRD needs to be in there in Ukraine, and he has the same idea for Iran now. And he ends by saying German hegemony is needed. So here you have the military integration agenda and German politicians pushing it. It's not the German people pushing it, it's German elite with the likes of Soros behind the money. Because with that in place, of course, you can control the destiny of the country for generations to come. And on the right there, he was talking in the tweet about participatory democracy. Well, Brian has explained many times on the broadcast what that is. It is post-democracy, as referred to by Lord Mandelson when he was controlling the British government. It's an age in which the only people who get a vote or a say in legislation during its drafting in particular are corporations and third sector people who at the top are in with the same global revolutionary mindset.
Yeah.
I'll just say for viewers who haven't picked up on the EBRD, that's the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and that is the lead bank that likes to get into areas after there's been trouble and destruction of national infrastructure, because they can help award the contracts, of course, to the very people who helped create the destruction in the first place. A little bit cynical, but close to the mark.
I just wanted to mention that here we are in 2018 and the hysteria over Donald Trump just continues to get even more unbelievable. So this was being pushed around yesterday. Attention, Trump supporters, you're directly responsible for everything that happens now. No more blaming Obama or Hillary. This is all yours. All of the nasty, stupid, petty BS that Donald Trump does belongs to you. Apparently, why are they getting even more hysterical? Well, because of course Russiagate just isn't working for them, well, they continue to flog that dead horse. And I recommend people go and have a look at this Consortium News article, The Still Missing Evidence of Russiagate. Alex, what are your thoughts on Russiagate and the continuing reaction to Trump?
If the evidence were there, Mike, it would have come out by now. There is a Guardian author, I'm sorry that his name eludes me right now, but Patrick Henningsen at 21st Century Wire has recently written an article and also put in his newsletters that this is a must-see. So if you go to 21st Century Wire, you'll find it ere long. It's one of these typical public school and Oxbridge type journalists who's written a whole book on the evidence for Russiagate. And then he's interviewed by a niche alternative media guy who specializes in calm interviews. I wouldn't be able to be that calm with him, and spends half an hour asking this Guardian writer, "Where's your evidence? Where's your evidence?" Yes, you say that, but where's your evidence? And this is a man who's written the book on it, and within 10 minutes, about 8 minutes actually, he's got so flustered by these questions that he says things to the American interviewer like, "Have you heard of Estonia? I've been to Russia, you know. The KGB does some very complicated and dark things." No evidence, no evidence. And this is really going to blow the Russiagate conspiracy out of the water this year. There is no evidence. If we get back to the JTRIG for a moment, and also the more active parts of GCHQ and NSA that look for digital signatures, not even in the sanitized public form is there anything that ties the activity of the hacking in American political servers into anything more specific than possibly a Russian IP address. Or possible criminal networks who, of course, specialize in working for many people at once. So they can equally well have worked for American political clients as for Russian government sources. So the evidence is absolutely not there. And if it was, we would have heard a lot more about it by now. This must be troubling a lot of my former colleagues in the intelligence services with their minds in gear now, because the only people still blethering on about Russia hacking European and American democracies are people with beloved of, shall we say, the liberal elite media, and they're not talking any specifics. There's even talk about one of Mr. Trump's people having gone to Prague apparently in order to meet with one of his co-conspirators, and he's proved that he's never been to the Czech Republic. And this is the level of disinformation that's getting out there. And in the end, the only people who believe the story are a vanishingly small number of people in the media bubble.
Yeah. Right, look, just before we move on from Consortium News, I just want to mention the fact that Robert Parry, the owner of that site and editor of that site, suffered a stroke over the Christmas break and it has affected his eyesight badly. He seems to be okay in other ways, but he's not able to write as prolifically as he was. I just wanted to take the opportunity to wish him all the best for a speedy recovery. Now, Meltdown. This is the scandal over Intel processors that's going on at the moment, mostly Intel processors. We'll come on to this in a second. Meltdown apparently came to light after the Register pushed out an article 2 days ago. Apparently Intel had intended to make this situation public in a week or so, but they got gazumped, as it were. It breaks the isolation between applications, programs that are running on computers and the operating system, and it means that programs could access memory that they're not supposed to get access to, and so various secret things like passwords and so on may be exposed to hackers very easily. But it wasn't just Meltdown that was announced. Well, just before we move on from Meltdown, we'll say that it's not clear whether this affects AMD or ARM processors at the moment. There seems to be some suggestion that some ARM processors that are in mobile phones are affected by it, but mainly it's Intel. The other thing that was discovered was another exploit, which is being called Spectre. And this, again, breaks isolation between different applications, and it allows an attacker to trick programs which are considered error-free, which follow best practices, into leaking secrets. And what the official website is saying is that the safety checks and best practices that are used by the program's authors, in fact, increase the attack surface. So it makes it easier for people to discover passwords and so on. Both of these problems are pretty significant. And the question is, what is Intel and the other processor manufacturers going to do about it? Well, so far they're looking to solve this problem using software, and the tests that have been run so far seem to imply that people's computers, servers and so on are likely to slow down between 5% and 30% as a result, because of the extra checks that have to be put in place in software. Well, the reaction from Intel has been pretty appalling. Here is their press release. And they say that Intel and other technology companies have been made aware of new security research describing software analysis methods that, when used for malicious purposes, have the potential to improperly gather sensitive data from computing devices that are operating as designed. Intel believes that these exploits do not have the potential to corrupt, modify, and delete data. That's all right. It doesn't have the potential to corrupt, modify, or delete data, but it does have the potential to leak your passwords, and people could access banking websites and so on, for example. Ultimately, at the end of this press release, as you read through it, you discover that they don't really care too much because it's affecting other companies as well. Really, at the end of the day, whose processors are you going to buy seems to be their attitude. Well, unfortunately, apparently, Intel was told about these exploits back in April. They had planned, they said, to release this information to the public in a week or so's time. But a few weeks before Christmas, just by coincidence, Brian, just totally coincidental, the chief executive of Intel sold off a lot of his stock in the company. Questions are being asked now about whether the Securities and Exchange Commission will be looking into this, because this could be considered insider trading. Well, I've just got one final question to ask before I offer Alex the opportunity to comment on this. I'm just wondering about the F-35. I wonder what kind of processors it's using. Is it got Intel inside? Well, I believe it doesn't. I believe it's using PowerPC chips. But anyway, Alex, what are your thoughts on this? Because it seems to me that if this is something which has been designed into Intel's processors, I believe since the days of the later versions of the Pentium processor, so going back to the late 90s, this is certainly something which potentially could have been exploited by security services. Maybe a bit unfortunate for the security services if this has now become public and they've got to find alternative ways to subvert people's machines. But are you aware of any maybe collusion's too hard a word, but is there any communication between manufacturers and security services in this area?
There probably is between manufacturers and security services, but it would go through cutout contracts and it would be compartmented. ECI would be the current name for that, exceptionally controlled information, basically a need-to-know basis, even when you've got top secret clearance. Any of this stuff is called special source when a nation's intelligence services, in the English-speaking world at least, when it uses telecoms and any kind of provider access. And it's kept very hushed up. At the hardware level, there's a long history of this. I can say this because I never heard it at GCHQ, but a lot of people said in quite reliable internet sources in the 1990s and 2000s that even back to the days of hardwired telephony, there was a blue wire that wasn't needed. And if you cut it, there would be no damage to the call. Telephone engineers were talking about this. The time frame you've identified, the mid to late 90s, is very much when criminality took over the American and British governments outright in a whole host of ways. I've just reviewed a book on the website about some aspects of this. The Clinton crime cabal, which in turn was set up by the Bush crime cabal. So from that era onwards, and a few years later, 9/11 and all the stuff that mushrooms after that, that's when the attitude begins of sucking up everyone's data. So that the physical hardware compromise could have been put in very easily at that stage. And before I forget, the interview I mentioned a moment ago is on a channel on YouTube called The Real News. And the title of it is simply, Where's the Collusion? The author who was filleted in that interview is Luke Harding. It's really a joy to watch.
The response from the manufacturers is quite, from the computer suppliers like Apple, for example, has been less than impressive. I mean, for example, Apple has already released a fix for this, but they seem to have only released a fix if you happen to be using their latest version of OS X 10.13. If you're using 10.12 or earlier, you don't seem to be getting a fix. So they seem to be basically attempting to bully people into upgrading without, otherwise you don't get the security fix. I don't think that's an appropriate solution to this problem. But of course, this affects many of the internet service providers that are hosting websites, hosting email accounts, and so on. And what I seem to be reading from the people that are providing these services is they're not getting the information from Intel in order to, quickly enough in order to deal with it. And so for a period of days, if not weeks, they continue to operate potentially at risk. So the response to this from the manufacturers, from Intel in particular, and from some of the manufacturers of computer hardware and operating systems doesn't seem to have been stellar.
Well, this is it. Silence may imply collusion, or at least that legal non-disclosure agreements or the threat of them are reigning supreme in those manufacturers. But we're not in a monopoly market anymore. That in the Western world, perhaps by design, Silicon Valley is the only producer of the area where chips are produced, and the only knowledge center where a bubble of highly qualified people, some of them recruited from India and China, it's true, but where they reside. Deliberately, there's never been anything like that set up in Germany or Britain or France. It's all been kept to Silicon Valley. But worldwide, if people are sick of Intel and many other physical hardware layer problems, there is now a possibility of rivalry. Within the former Soviet Union, Armenia had its own Silicon Valley in the 80s that was on a par with California at the time. And those brains are still there. There's the Indians themselves, the Malaysians, the Koreans. They're well able to produce the very exacting demands required of a new chip design. And Russia in particular, I think, could draw these strings together and produce a rival chip for both PC and, if need be, also for Mac or Mac equivalent in the end. So it's really, we're shooting ourselves in our foot and hastening the demise of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much for that. We'll end on the note of a big thank you to people who sent us Christmas cards, but also people who took the trouble to email us over the Christmas period to say thank you for what the UK column does. And I have to say to our audience that it is a big boost to have people take the time to thank us for what we're doing. And some very interesting material came in. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Joshua from the United States, who emailed in, plus gave us some very interesting information about what's happening in American schools. And if there's trouble with chips, there's certainly trouble with censorship of social media in UK. And I'm going to say that UK column, as indeed many other alternative media outlets, are realizing we are under attack. What can our viewers and listeners do to help us? It is simply to spread the word in every available way. So if you can take the trouble on a daily basis to email out to, say, 10 of your contacts and point them at UK Column News, we can still get this information out there. But be under no illusions, the British government is starting to try and censor free speech because it is so frightened about the truth emerging as to corruption, child abuse, and of course, Britain and the US helping to stir up these terrible wars overseas, particularly in the Middle East. That's it from us today. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.